All right. We will get started here. So I'll just share my screen. Great. We've called this webinar Evolve. And in the next 2 hours, we're going to unpack something called the adaptive cycle. It's an ecological model that describes nature's evolutionary processes, how it deals with change. And then we're going to unpack some of the key principles from nature and from that model to figure out how we can use that as a metaphor and a metric for how to adjust our own businesses and personal lives potentially. We'll start with this. I don't know if you've read the IPCC report that came out a couple weeks ago, but we're seeing dramatic change. I mean, the headlines were often saying that climate change is no longer about to happen, it's happening. And I think they're saying that because a lot more cities are being devastated than before, that the impact of climate change is hitting more people in more, I'd say, upper class or affluent communities. And so in light of what's going on with COVID-19 and climate change, we're seeing dramatic change and disruption at multiple levels. But I take solace in looking to nature. This is where I find hope, and this is where I continue to draw hope. This is what biomimicry is all about. It's looking to design ideas from the natural world, and nature can teach us a lot about change. So this is the adaptive cycle. And hopefully we'll walk through this and unpack it a bit. But the adaptive cycle is a 4-box model that describes ecological evolution and the way that nature maintains resilience through change. So it's somewhat contradictory, is that change is what drives resilience in nature. In the front loop, there are 2 phases called exploitation and conservation. So in exploitation, you can imagine after a disturbance like a forest fire or a pest invading an ecosystem, there's this new opportunity that emerges. And in exploitation, things called R species come in and they take over. You could think of them as the pioneer species or the innovators that come in and exploit new opportunities. They're creative, they're mobile, they have shallow roots, you can imagine, and they're looking for opportunity, looking for new ways of configuring and exploiting. But what they're really doing is actually creating a very important service. They're helping dissipate gradients, and they use any available resource. And in doing so, they're actually stabilizing the larger ecosystem. They're also providing the biomass for larger species to come in and grow, because these R species usually have shallow roots, lots of progeny, lots of seeds, and they live and die fairly quickly. So they have this constant rapid cycling that's taking place. And that allows biomass to build up. And so through ecological succession, through growth and renewal, release and dying, larger species will start to emerge. And these larger species are called K species. And they enter into what's called a state of conservation. So a state of conservation, it's called that because the resources that were once readily available are now actually locked up in larger, more complex and dense ecosystems. You can imagine as this ecosystem grows, there's larger species that contain a lot of those nutrients that were once free, that, you know, those carbons and nitrogens, oxygens, phosphorus, they're all now locked up and a little bit more difficult to access. That's why it's called a state of conservation. They're stored, for example, in trunks of trees. And it's a state of conservation, like I said, because it's much more complex system and it's much more difficult to adapt to changing environments in terms of its speed and its ability to make large scale adaptations if the environment around it changes. So in the back loop, what nature does, it has this technique of releasing to allow reorganization. It releases at multiple scales, and that release could be a tree falling over, or it could just be the leaves falling every autumn, or it could be an entire forest fire. But that release allows the nutrients that were once stored in that organism to go back into the system and allow new species to exploit this opportunity. And these species might be better equipped or more attuned to the new conditions. So that release allows that adaptation to occur. So I'll give you an example. Think of a willow tree near a river. If that river were to dry up, the willow, which is a water-loving species, will eventually die, and all of those stored nutrients from the tree will go back into the system. And some new species will exploit those. Another R species, which might be more appropriate to the new conditions and might be therefore more drought resistant. Like I said, this release happens at multiple scales. And that's called a panarchy. So a panarchy just describes the way that systems are embedded within systems. And at each of those levels, each of those systems, they're all releasing and reorganizing. And so you think of your body, the cells within genes, or genes within cells, cells within organs, organs within your full body. All of those have their own adaptive cycle. Even the leaves on a tree, the leaves have their own adaptive cycle. As they fall, the new leaves that come will be slightly modified through genetic modification to be, a certain color, a certain shape, or even the branches are going to make adaptations semi-independently from the rest of the tree. So when you think of nature's systems, all of these small adaptive cycles are contributing to this very slow morphing that takes place, this slow adaptation that takes place. And this panarchy kind of describes how systems are embedded within systems. And all of those adaptive cycles are capable of releasing to allow reorganization. So when you think of a complex ecosystem, there are all of these organisms that are autonomously changing. And they're using information from their environment to make small scale adaptations, to fit the context that they're in, and to make the changes necessary to survive. What we're learning about ecosystems today is that they strive to be the most diverse and complex possible. If you leave a system be, it will naturally strive for diversity. And in that diversity, that's how it thrives. And that's a really cool kind of way of realizing is that these systems are all working together to make as much complexity as possible, because that complexity allows it to be more resilient to change. And we'll talk about that. But what's unique about humans, and this is where the conversation gets interesting, is that we have an ability to actually stay in conservation. Unlike any other organism, we have harnessed fire. We've harnessed stored energy to resist change. And so what that means is we can use fire to create robust materials that resist their environment. Think of the way that we build infrastructure to resist 100-year storm events. That's coming from this paradigm of separation or of resistance, and it's coming from this capability that we have to make robust materials. We can make very strong materials. And we tend to unnaturally avoid release by putting energy into systems that are too big in our eyes to collapse. Think of any large system, human-created system that is attempting to collapse, and what our natural reaction is to that, whether it be a big business, whether it be a relationship, whether it be a political system, whether it be infrastructure that we're connected to. We will inject energy, whether it's money, whether it's bylaws, whether it's more material. We'll inject things to try and keep a system in a state of conservation. The problem with this, however, is that if you keep a system in conservation for too long, you resist change at multiple scales. So these lower adaptive cycles in the panarchy get cut off. And you cut off these adaptations that actually help the system stay relevant. And so one of my heroes, Buzz Halling, said, the longer one view, or you could say that as one system, the longer a system is held beyond its time, The sharper and more extreme, the surprise, the perception of complexity, and the resulting adjustment. It takes a lot of energy to maintain a system in conservation. And the longer that a system is held in conservation while the environment around it changes, the greater the potential for disruption and the more energy it takes to hold it there. To give you kind of a visualization for this, this is something Janine Benyus told me way back in the day. And she said, you can imagine a natural system is like a ball in a bowl of water. And so as you move that bowl of water, the water, which represents the environment, is changing, but the ball will somewhat roll and adapt to that change because it's working with the environment. It's using information to make adaptations at multiple scales. And all of those inputs of information in the panarchy allow it to be locally attuned. And I mean, of course, there are some times when large scale releases happen in nature, but for the most part, when left alone, they're able to adapt and adjust to the environment because they're pushing to become in equilibrium with the environment. In the same metaphor, humans are more like squares or cubes, sorry, in that bowl of water. It's more rigid. And so when the bowl of water is moving, when it's adapting and adjusting, that cube has more jerky movements because it's not as attuned to environmental conditions. You know, again, we try to build for 100-year storm events, which means that we're not actually taking information seasonally. We're not learning about each year how rain impacts the design. We're just waiting for the 100-year storm event, which we know is happening more and more frequently. The bigger the release, the bigger the opportunity. So I think what's interesting is that today we're seeing a massive release. Whether we like it or not, release is taking place. And that can be a pretty confronting thing because it means the things that we were so comfortable with for perhaps hundreds of years are now being challenged. In resilience literature, this is why they're called wicked problems. Wicked problems have no precedent for how to solve them. The facts are way too uncertain. The requirement for decision-making is very rapid. We need urgent decisions. The stakes are very high. And because of the global nature of things, there are so many people engaged in the problem solving that there's a high likelihood of values being in dispute, meaning like people with different opinions are all going to have to work together to figure this out. So these wicked problems have no precedent for how to solve them, which can be somewhat frightening. But I think that's why I take solace in biomimicry and in natures, because we can draw on a system that has proven sustainability. It's been around for billions of years. And so I view it as the solutions are already there. We just have to figure out how to use them. One of my favorite stories of system shifts are Interface Carpet and Ray Anderson, who was the CEO. So Interface Carpets back in the 90s was still one of the top carpet manufacturers, but one of Ray's employees came to them and said, what's our sustainability strategy? And he called it, this was in 1994, and he called it a spear in the chest moment, where he recognized the environmental impact of his business and the fact that they didn't really have a long-term strategy for sustainability. So he struggled to sleep that night, and the very next day he started to put a plan in place, and he gathered some of the best ecological thinkers in North America to develop what they called the mountain of sustainability. And this was a very ambitious project at the time. So in the 1990s, they set out to be totally fossil-free, to produce zero waste, to eliminate all toxic substances, to change the culture and create a business model that demonstrates sustainability-based commerce by 2020. So they had about 26 years to do this. They did use biomimicry. Janine Benyus was a part of that team. And so they integrated biomimicry technologies into their strategy. They made a carpet based on the forest floor. They made an adhesive that was non-toxic using nature as a model. But what's amazing is that Ray had this paradigm shift. He had this release And he took it upon himself to reorganize his company. And they found that actually from 1995 to 1996, Interface Carpets actually grew in sales by $200 million. So they instantly showcased how a sustainability-based company could increase revenue back in the 1990s. And what's amazing is that they've hit, I think, almost all their targets by 2020. Unfortunately, Ray passed away and didn't get to see Interface reach that mission. But I think what's beautiful is that it represents somebody who had this adaptive cycle personally. And by having it internally, changing his thoughts, changing his mentality, releasing and reorganizing what a business should be, he changed his business, but he also changed the entire carpet industry. So you can see it's an example of that panarchy where one small adaptive cycle influenced the adaptive cycle of a carpet company, which influenced the adaptive cycle of a carpet industry, and which I'm now using as an example of adaptation for all industries. One of the things that stops us from release and reorganization and what makes humans so unique is really about how we think. It's our biases, it's our paradigms. Our brains cognitively can't handle the complexity of the natural world. They can't handle complexity in general. And so it tends to simplify things. That's why we like things to stay the same. That's why we like things in conservation. It's because our mind then doesn't have to think about it. Think of our walls, for example. We don't have to think about whether they're going to keep our roofs up because we have the assumption, we have this system in place that they're static, that somebody trained and responsible has put those up. And so that can allow us to remove it from our attentive awareness. We don't have to think about it. That's what our brain likes to do. It likes to simplify the complex. And so when something disrupts that simplicity, it kind of inspires fear because it's now, we don't have a basis to stand upon. So uncertainty to the ego inspires fear because without a map, your ego will inject histories of what it knows in order to avoid uncertainty. So when things happen, like climate change, COVID-19, those are great examples of massive disruptions that can inspire fear. And what our brain is trained to do is just pull from histories and try to inject them into the future, that this is how we will deal with those problems. But I also think that that's a missed opportunity to take a moment and creatively reimagine how to solve those problems. That's where biomimicry could be a perfect opportunity, a perfect tool, is because we can actually inject a new creative way of solving that solution. As this quote says, uncertainty to the creative is pure possibility. So that's the adaptive cycle. And I want to kind of bring it to a conversation. And I want to start by just with this question. And feel free to share in the chat box. Where do you see examples of systems in conservation? And it can be anything. So we're not restricting this to just your business, but everywhere. Where are examples of systems in conservation? Feel free to write in the chat box. Religion and universities. Yeah. Lawns. Yeah. Kathy, yes. Government and policy. Government. Yeah. Where else are systems in states of conservation? Water dams. Yeah. So physical infrastructure, electrical generation. Yeah. Parenthood. That's interesting. Top-down government styles. Culture. That's interesting. Susanna. So culture is an interesting one, and zoos, yeah. Cities. Legacy industries. So Ethan, that's a great point, and I'll jump on that, but keep sharing your ideas. Ethan points out tax incentives for legacy industries. I saw the Canadian government's just, I think, committing to inject more money into fossil fuel industries. But that's an example of how we will inject energy into systems that we think are too big to collapse. Another example is in 2008 when we saw the economic recession. In North America, the big three automobile manufacturers went through a massive disruption and were about to collapse. But as a collective, as a society, we injected a lot of money into those systems. And I can see both sides of the argument. On one side, those automobile manufacturers represent a lot of jobs and a lot of livelihoods. And so to inject them and keep them in the state of conservation makes sense from that one particular view. But I think what was happening is that the system was showing that those automobile manufacturers may be out of tune with the rest of the environment and maybe wanted to release. And that's where we saw Tesla and electric motor vehicles kind of take that opportunity and show this is what the new clients want or what the new environment requires, the electric vehicles instead of the older traditional vehicles. So systems want to release, and it's amazing to see kind of how we react to those systems. I'll speak really quickly to culture that I think Susanna mentioned. Culture is a big reason why we stay in conservation. So paradigm shifts can happen more easily at the individual level. Like if you think of Ray Anderson at Interface Carpets, he had an internal kind of paradigm shift, and that allowed him to change things. But what stops system from changing could be the culture that you're embedded with. You think of outliers in different cultures and how they might be ostracized, or how we might create social kind of behaviors to try and keep those people separate, because they represent disruption, they represent chaos, and the collective culture wants stability, it wants calm. And so there's like mechanisms, whether they're inherent or explicit, that happen that try to like stop that outlier from disrupting the social order. So culture is a major example of conservation. And it could be company culture as well. So if you run a company or you're in a company, recognize what is the company culture, and does it encourage diversity? Does it encourage creative disruption? I think probably that's the first point we'll make about the adaptive cycle in your company for resilience is how welcome are you to disruption, and how much are you trying to conserve the current system? So Injecting says humans have an inherent need for control, which leads to creation of systems which enables them to retain control. How do we use biomimicry to change that en masse? That's a great question. Example, political control, financial control, which drives the world today. So humans have a need for control because, like I said earlier, we have an inherent desire to reduce complexity. I think that's probably one of the biggest reasons why humans have built themselves out of nature, is because nature, our cities represent control. They're engineered. They keep nature out. And any nature that enters the city is relatively controlled as well. Our park systems, our lawns, like Kathy said, and we put a lot of energy into maintaining those systems. So the question is, how do we creatively disrupt those systems? And actually, I'll put it back to you guys, because that's our next question. How could you imagine creatively releasing these systems? And don't worry too much about the sustainability part. That's tough to say, but just for now, let's just imagine creative ways we could disrupt the system. How can systems be influenced? And maybe you could use nature as your model for now. Any ideas or examples? Nomadic cities, that's super interesting. Greg, do you want to just jump on and share what you mean by nomadic cities? If not, no worries. Cities which only allow a finite number of people based on the holding capacity. Introduce opposing ideas into a system. That's a good one, Ian. Show the benefits of going with the new systems versus maintaining the old ones. That's a great one, Burhan. The idea that a city has to be able to move in order to escape peril. So Greg was mentioning back to adaptive cities, pilot projects, experiments. By doing, quotations, Noah says, take your solution and introduce it into the system. Yeah, so there's some great examples in there. So release, one is introducing opposing ideas into a system and to show the benefits of profit increase. I think two examples that I find intriguing after the 2008 collapse were Airbnb and Uber. Those were examples of two kind of ideas, two pioneers. You could think of them as those R species that were exploiting opportunities. So using that adaptive cycle again, as the system collapsed, these two kind of ideas were injected into the system kind of as experiments. So ground up, like somebody said, introducing is an opposing idea. It was an idea that hadn't been thought of. It was very weed-like thinking. And they saw great growth and great benefit. And so in times of release, there's huge opportunity for innovation to occur. And so you have to impose creative new ideas. That's one way to release a system, as Ian mentioned, introduce these opposing or different ideas. And then as Burhan mentions, is you have to have, it has to have a value. Airbnb and Uber, people saw value to that. Instead of taking taxis or instead of taking renting hotels, these new platforms gave opportunity, the economic benefits of driving your own car, driving people around, or renting your house out, or unused rooms. So to encourage release, we have to have a creative idea that comes from the bottom up. And we also have to have an economic interest in that bottom up idea. So that's one, and it's difficult to know whether there's an interest unless you test it. And so if you think of nature, there's that constant testing, that adaptive cycle. You know, you try a prototype, and it could be a social or a physical prototype, but you try a prototype at really small scales, and if it's any good, take it to the next adaptive cycle. If that's any good, if you're seeing some interest, take it to the next. I actually had one of my friends built a company and sold it in I think 3 or 4 years for $7 million. And the one thing that he said is, and the one thing we explore in our course is, prove your concept in under $200. And I think what he's saying is, do a really small scale adaptive cycle. And so his technology was a coupon-based technology, and he built an experience for a bunch of people who were his high expectation customers. They came into a room. This is pre-COVID, and he built an experience that represented what his app would do in all under $200. So it's actually like paper representation of his app. And he proved his concept in that case so that he actually could then go to funders or find more funding or inject more funding into the problem. So it's those small scale adaptations, the small scale pilot projects, as Christina mentions, and experiments. Whereas Noah says, just by doing. Nature doesn't spend a lot of time thinking. Nature spends time doing small scale iterations and adaptations. So I'll look at some of these other ones. Decentralizing the energy network, so off-grid. Carlos, it's a great example of release. Now, the challenge is when we say decentralize, the grid, you could imagine the resistance from the system, because, and same with, I think somebody mentioned fossil fuels. The challenge is we as a collective depend so heavily on these certain systems, on a centralized system. So it'd be very difficult to encourage a massive release in these systems. So these big ones that are really rooted, I mentioned it, like how do you evolve a rooted system? Using the adaptive cycle, it's either a large scale collapse, which might be out of our hands, and I'm not really interested in because I like being able to turn my lights on. Or it could be through that small scale revolting, where you come up with ideas and you prove the concept to encourage a new way of looking at a problem. Kimberly mentioned, and I'll just bring this up, reconciliation with Indigenous peoples and learning from them. This is something that at Frontiers we're very passionate about because we have an elder on our board, and she's a good friend of mine who, when I told her what we do at biomimicry, or what biomimicry is, she kind of laughed and said, yeah, well, we've been doing biomimicry for thousands of years, which I think is spot on, but it represents a different way of, different than me, of looking at the natural world and seeing it not as something to take from, but using Janine Benyus's words, something we could learn from. So a release could be actually just that paradigm shift. For me, my release happened in 2004 when I learned about the Fibonacci sequence, or the spirals in nature, and realized that nature could teach us how to do engineering or how to communicate math and science in a beautiful, elegant way. And so that's where my creative release happened. And then since then, I've been constantly adapting and iterating how to practically apply biomimicry. Yeah, so Injecting says, does Uber have a sustainable model since it's predatory in nature? I never said Uber was sustainable. I said Uber was interesting in that it copies kind of that pioneering mentality, or it's a good example of a pioneer species. What is interesting today, and maybe I'll jump to it before we go back, is we have an opportunity to stop making the same mistakes we've made in the past. So in these releases, the big fear that we have is the unknown. And like I said, with the unknown, we'll inject our histories into that solution set. So if a city is disrupted by an environmental situation like a hurricane or an earthquake, like in Haiti, it's often our first response is to build back the same way that it was, to go back to normal, to go back to that security of the known. And I understand that. It's terrifying to be in that space of the unknown. But what biomimicry does, and what's so beautiful, is that it's given us insight into a set of principles that life uses, that if we inject those into the next iteration, into the reorganization and exploitation, then we might be building a more sustainable model. We might be moving away from this constant cycle that we're on, that we make bad ideas, we try to keep them. Well, sorry, we make ideas, we try to keep them, the environment changes, they become outdated, and then we either spend a lot of energy or they collapse. But nature's shown us a model over 3.8 billion years that could last over the long haul. And so when we think about release, we have to think about what is it that we want to rebuild, and what principles could we draw on to ensure that our ideas are more in harmony with nature. Somebody says mimic forest ecosystems to rethink cities. Carlos, I think that's a great idea. We use forest as a metaphor often. Placing more value on qualitative aspects of systems instead of hyper-focus on metric and quantitative constructs, relationships, complexity, etc., which drive outcomes. That's a great point, Kathy. So I'll go back and just mention we've come up with some creative ways of releasing. And here are some principles that we could use from the adaptive cycle to help us with that release. And I'll kind of quickly go through these. Oh man, there's lots of good stuff in here. Sorry, I'll come back to some of these comments. Principle number one is to encourage self-organization, local interactions at small scales to promote emergent patterns. So you can see in the adaptive cycle that in a state of release, all of these R species, these pioneers are coming, ground up. They're all small scale, they're rapidly producing, and they kind of self-organize. They work to figure out how to behave within a system. In that, you need a culture of experimentation and small scale release. You have to be able to let go of things. And that's terrifying for a business when that is so bottom line driven. Release means potentially loss of revenue, or it means allocating resources to something that is expected to fail. And I think it's good to recognize that in nature, there's no such thing as like failure. It's all about adaptation. It's just a tree that doesn't work might feel like a waste of time, but in the long run, it's actually a very important aspect for that failure to take place. Failure is necessary. And I know a lot of cultures even will say, like, corporate cultures, like, yeah, fail fast and fail often. And then I know a couple companies off the top of my head that say that. And then when when people in their company fail, it's actually looked down upon, and there's a lot of anger and frustration. So it's easier said than done to create a culture of experimentation and small scale release. But if you want to be a company that lasts over the long haul, I think it's necessary. And especially in a time like today when things are changing so dramatically, you have to have small scale releases taking place in order to survive. Think of Blockbuster. That's an example of a company that wasn't able to small scale release as the whole videotape and movie industry changed. Which goes to point three, avoid short-term thinking and conservation. Unless you want to be a short-term company, or unless you just want to focus on your life and not the lives of future generations, which maybe sounds really harsh, but maybe that is where you're at. And I don't judge it. I'm not saying that in a judgmental way, but avoiding short-term thinking and conservation is about recognizing that these small-scale changes that take place today will have lasting impacts on the future that we're creating. So you can imagine that where we're at now in the adaptive cycle is we're on a big release, and we're given the opportunity to reorganize. And so as we build that next front loop, that exploitation to conservation, we have to be really considerate of how far in the future are we looking. And going back to Kim's point, indigenous traditions of 7-generation thinking, is a great model that we could pull from, thinking long-term. Another principle for shifting a system is acknowledge biases and embrace creativity, heterogeneity, and uncertainty. We've kind of alluded to this several times in this conversation, that our thoughts are a major barrier to diversity and to resilience. And what I mean by that is our paradigms. It's the set of assumptions that we've developed for how to behave and interact with the world. All of us have a paradigm, whether we like it or not, whether we acknowledge it or not. And a paradigm is kind of like the map that we use to navigate this crazy world. Our paradigms are influenced by our upbringing, by our culture, by our education, by our physical environments. All of these influence how we interact and behave with the world. And what's amazing about paradigms is that, or our brains at least, is that our brains will actually dismiss information that might not align with our paradigm. So we'll actually wipe away information we won't even see things. It's quite incredible. Like our eyes will not even see things that might contradict our paradigm or our belief system. That's why it's hard to have a dialogue with somebody that's so dramatically opposed to your paradigm, because you're using information and being fed information that aligns with what you believe. And you do that because it re-triggers that certainty mechanism in your brain. You want to make sure that you're doing the right thing, that you have certainty, that you have, you're avoiding complexity. And so you'll use information from your environment to keep proving that. It's like, oh yes, I'm on the right path. My paradigm is correct. But what that means is that you're actually missing probably 80% of what's actually happening in the world. And I think this is interesting, especially how it relates to nature and biomimicry. I grew up with a specific paradigm about what nature is, and that's nature is used. I mean, I grew up on a farm, so we use nature to produce food. We control it. We inject energy into it. Forests are for lumber. It wasn't until later on that this paradigm started to be a bit disrupted. And it wasn't until biomimicry when I realized, well, nature could teach us so much more. So this principle for shifting a system, I think, is very valuable, that you have to acknowledge your biases, because you can't embrace another paradigm until you at least start to look at the one you're currently using. That's how I think, at least, is you can't start to shift your system or shift your behavior or shift your paradigm until you know your current biases, both explicit and implicitly. And that can be a pretty confronting thing, because we're essentially asking you question everything that you believe to be true about the world. And we're not saying do it forever. We're saying just take a moment in time, because if you can do that, there might be an element of creativity. There might be an injection of a new idea that can help you make a beautiful new technology or new idea. For example, think of, again, of Blockbuster. Blockbuster wasn't disrupted by somebody in the movie industry. I can't remember who, but somebody who created Netflix or who created online movies was actually not even a part of that industry at all. They came from a totally different way of thinking. And that's a good example of exploitation with really creative thinking. Ideas that weren't biased by the tradition, that were creative and fresh. So yeah, that's a big one. The fifth one that we've got here is incorporate multiple layers and frequency of feedback. This goes to, I think a couple people mentioned top-down hierarchies. In top-down hierarchies, it's very difficult for the people making decisions to have all the information. So in nature, these small adaptive cycles allow every piece of the system to make decisions independently based on the information they're collecting. So if you think of the tree again, that leaf is contributing to the whole system because it's allowed to make these small scale genetic adaptations. It's the same in a business. If you can have every person in your organization have some autonomy and decision making, and that feedback, integrated into the business strategy, you're going to be much more resilient because you have all of these feeders. It's like all of these tentacles out there learning about what's happening in the environment, and then having the freedom, the semi-autonomous freedom to make changes in the system. And then the last one that I'll mention is leverage existing assets and reconfigure them in completely new ways. This one I love because after release, what happens in nature is that a tree will go back to its basic parts, its basic constituents, its molecules, its molecular level, just the carbons and the nitrogens, phosphorus and oxygens. Like I said, it goes back to these basic building blocks, which an organism can take and repurpose and reorganize. If you think of nature, it uses just a subset of the periodic table of elements, but yet with that subset can make such beautifully diverse things, structures, processes, behaviors, patterns. I think that's so amazing. So if you take that principle into your business, look at assets you have and what are really creative ways that you could reconfigure them, whether your assets be the people in your company or the creative ideas in your company or physical infrastructure. It takes real creativity to pull those apart and repurpose them into new ways. But that's what is a key to resilience and to shifting a system. I'll take a pause there and open it up if there's any questions. I see the chat's kind of booming here. And I'll look, but if you have questions specifically to these principles or to the adaptive cycle, I'm open, or feel free to raise your hand and we can bring you up to chat. Injecting, yeah. Do you want to just unmute and say hello?
Hey, hi. Thanks a lot for that, Jamie. Love this conversation. See, I've been working in sustainability, for about 10 years now. And one of the questions I had is, I could be following all these principles. End of the day, there are some economic realities that I need to ensure for my and my family's sustenance, right? And those depend on people who may not follow these principles. The question I'm always asking is, how do I, with my set of beliefs, how would I be able to influence en masse the group of people who are controlling the assets which determine how we behave? We have 7 billion people in the world, but it's a very small handful of people who are controlling how the rest of humanity will think. And that in turn determines how we are going to allow other flora or fauna to live on the planet. Because we don't respect that balance, we have all these outbreaks. So that's my question, how do we ensure that we can influence en masse using biomimicry, using natural principles, so that people can overcome millions of years of evolution of need for control?
Yeah, it's a great question. If I knew the answer, I may not be here, but I think what I would suggest to you is, for my own sanity, I'll often not focus on, as you mentioned, those few way up here that seem to be controlling the system. I don't know who they are. I don't have access to them. And so they're not really worth my time. Instead, what I would do, or what I'm doing, is focusing on my local environment, which is another life principle. Who are, financial, like, where can I think a part of your question too is, how do I make money and do what I believe? And I don't see those as potentially two different things. How do you make money while doing what you believe? And I think that's what Biomimicry Frontiers represents. Is it's a company that is fully embedded in mine and Ash's values, as something we're passionate about. And we look for local opportunities to engage in economic kind of growth. And through these small scale kind of successes, we keep finding strategies to make money, take care of my family, while doing things in a proper way. And we can talk more about the examples or principles that we've used, or the lessons that we've used, in another session. But I think that's the one thing I'd mention, is just focusing on locally, being very, very locally attuned. And what's surprising is that we're finding today that the amount of money that's available to sustainable business is growing dramatically and rapidly. That people are seeing it as whether they're doing it to greenwash or not, to be associated with greenwashing, that's another conversation. But the amount of funds being funneled towards sustainable products and sustainable development is rapidly increasing. And even though lots of people are still doing things that are not sustainable, I personally can't worry about all of them right now because my mental health couldn't handle it. But if I can make these small changes, and then if I can encourage other people to do the same thing, then I think we're starting to make that bottom line of the panarchy, start to make these adaptations. We're exploiting our local opportunity, we're reorganizing, we're creating new states of conservation based on nature-based principles. I do believe that this movement, the sustainability movement, is going to happen from the bottom up. And when we really understand the deep principles of nature, which includes working with Indigenous people, then we'll start to create these small scale systems that are rooted in new paradigms or new principles to me, or alternative principles to the way that it's been. And slowly those systems will grow, and hopefully that's how we plant a garden of sustainability. I know it's altruistic, or it's like a utopian vision, but that's what nature teaches us. That's the adaptive cycle, is you can't recreate a forest by cutting it down and planting and just creating a bunch of trees. You have to go through iterations, through small scale adaptations, injecting new ideas, new species into an existing forest. And eventually that forest, if those species are good and in harmony with the natural environment, then they'll succeed. So hopefully that gives you something to support your question. Yeah, happy to take it offline. Any other question? Oh, great. I believe you. Yeah, that's the same belief. So being locally attuned is a life's principle that we adhere to as much as possible. And I think that's one way of looking at these systems. Instead of trying to take down the larger systems that control everything, as you said, see if you can disrupt those small systems, or those systems at a small scale. Here's a question from Javiera, I think. What I've learned is that trying to change others' beliefs always results in resistance and tension. When you apply your ideals on your everyday life and share them, not force them with others in a small scale, anyone that is open to change, some people aren't, will learn from you and slowly adopt this new way. So the thing about paradigm shifts, I think I'm starting to communicate, is that they're much easier to happen at the individual level, and they're fiercely resisted at a cultural or social level. So you're right, trying to inject your opinions or your philosophies onto unwilling participants is never going to work. Because like I said, their brains won't compute something that confronts their current paradigm. So this is why I think application is so important. If you can showcase your ideas, what we say in biomimicry is that if you think naturally, you'll build naturally. Everything stems from our thoughts. And so if you can embrace a biomimicry mentality, a biomimicry paradigm, everything that you do will be biomimetic, because your paradigm is the root of everything. It's your behaviors, it's your actions, it's your, the way you interact with people. So I think the key to really shifting the system is to not tell people about it, but to show it. And I know that the irony, I'm trying to tell you what we've done and use biomimicry, but really what I'm trying to do in this conversation is encourage you to see biomimicry as a lens and how to inject it into your own thinking. What are some of the principles that we could use or understand? And then from there, create products, create businesses, create strategies that are rooted in these nature-based paradigms. Yeah, we're not going to, I think a great example of that is the conversation around climate change. And I'm super fascinated by this. Despite all of the reports, and I'll use Canada as an example, the things that are going on in the world with climate change are incredibly dramatic. Like there's things that, it sounds terrifying, but even in the first kind of Canada's going through an election, and in the first conversation with the current prime minister, there was no questions about climate change. So I'm interested in why we're so resistant to putting in action towards climate change. And one of the things I've found in my research is that it represents an existential crisis in that when people tell us, hey, you need to do something about climate change, it's a massive problem. Even though we hope that sharing with them the scary facts about what's happening, even though we're hoping that those facts will inspire them into action, it actually does the opposite. And that's because the research that I've read is that people are inherently afraid to die. And climate change represents kind of an existential crisis that if you tell somebody, hey, everything's going to go to hell, we better do something about it, instead of actually doing something about it, people will often react internally and start to think, how can I live my best life then? And that might mean buying more things, being more individually focused. So when we're communicating things, what I've learned is that you can't scare somebody into the action that you're hoping for. There's psychological research that shows scaring people actually will make them more internally focused. And so I've found that really interesting, is that when you try to promote a certain idea, consider how you're communicating it and what is it evoking in that person. Is it evoking fear? Is it evoking you need to change your paradigm, which also means fear and complexity? Because that's not going to be a good place to inspire change. They're not going to come from that place of fear and be like, all right, yes, we need to do something different. They're going to be like, how do I take care of my basic needs? Because I'm now in a stage of fright. So that's, I think, another principle for shifting a system, is that we have to not scare people into change, but to encourage people to do these small scale releases and failures. Yeah, I think, as Carlos says, it evokes fear, and only when we see a possibility of success will we move forward in action. I think that's a great example. Most of the world are followers, and so we need to see examples that prove the concept. And so that's why we need more people applying biomimicry principles to show that this is a viable way of doing things. Ray Anderson is one of our pioneers. Indigenous communities are our pioneers. These are people that we can follow and learn from, and hopefully encourage more success stories. Awesome. Any other questions about the principles of shifting a system? I know we talked about many things there. Okay, we'll keep moving a bit here. The longer, this is C.S. Halling again, Buzz, who also passed away recently. He's the person who created the adaptive cycle model. And he said, the longer one view is held beyond its time, the sharper and more extreme the surprise, the perception of complexity and resulting adjustment. So that's why I think today is so kind of frightening to so many people. And climate change is causing a lot of mental health issues, is because it's a large release and it's resulting in larger perception of complexity. So I'm going to share with you a tool that we use at Frontiers to help encourage people, whether it's a client or our own company culture, to manage change, to come up with a new state of conservation. This is something that we developed when I was teaching at OCAD and when I was studying the adaptive cycle. It's really using the model and jumping ahead. So imagine we've already gone through the back loop and we're looking to create the new front loop. What we do is we actually start with the end in mind, using that old adage, start with the end in mind. And we start to imagine what our design fiction, or what our next state of conservation, our next basin of attraction, it's called in resilience literature, will look like. And we use a tool called design fiction. And this is something that we've used with clients, that we continue to use with clients. And design fiction is the development of believable ideas that may not yet be possible, but that provoke a conversation of what could be or should be possible. What that means is we try to drop some of those barriers that keep us in the state of conservation. We try to drop the focus on bylaws, for example, or political kind of conversations or finances, which I know are important, but for the sake of the exercise, we just move them to the side a bit to allow what it is that we're really trying to do to step forward. And we'll come up with scenarios, scenarios of different design fictions or different design fiction scenarios. And they're not outrageous. They're not ideas that can never happen. They're very believable ideas that might not yet be possible, or that provoke a conversation of what could be or should be possible. And we use that design fiction scenario as a conversation starter. So we'll talk to the people about this scenario, and we'll start to unpack what it is about that scenario that they like and they don't like, focusing specifically on their values. And these design fictions will always be injected with life's principles, because that's what we believe is going to be a sustainable future. But what we found in this tool is that we actually get to the root of why things can't happen. So what I found in the past is a lot of people will just hide behind barriers like bylaws, or my boss will never let this happen, or, oh, that's way too expensive. But in a design fiction scenario analysis, what we find is that because those are off to the side, we will actually see that people might be more honest about why they don't want that. It's like, it might be rooted in fear. It's like, well, that's never been done before. Or it's like, you know, I don't know if we can manage that, or, you know, whatever it is that comes up for them. We use a metric from IDEO, which is a design company in the States, that we look at desirability, we look at feasibility, and we look at viability of that idea. And we can kind of flesh out more deeper rooted issues as to why that idea might not happen. But we also find why that idea is really exciting to them. And we find it's very useful in developing a next state of conservation. So going back to this model, we're trying to help co-create the world that they want to live in the future, or the world and legacy that they want to leave behind. And we can identify some of the barriers, the resistance, the true resistance to why that idea they perceive couldn't happen. And you know, that allows us to kind of pick it apart. So for example, when in Guelph, we worked on this and on a development, and they said, well, it's never been done before. We're going to do an offsite or an on-site wastewater treatment system in the city. And they said, that's never been done before. And I was like, okay, that's your barrier. Perfect. Let's figure out how to release that barrier. And so this gave us a small scale release opportunity. And what we did is we just researched all of the communities around the world who have done exactly what we're trying to do and have shown and proven success. And so we found a community in northeastern United States, up in Maine, that had a very similar situation and had built a technology that had been running for over a decade that could satisfy the fear that the Guelph community had. And so we could bring that in and show them, hey, I know you're afraid that because this has never been done before. Well, in fact, we found that this community has done something very similar with great success. And so you don't have to worry so much. And we could help walk them through that complexity. And we talked to that other community and brought their technology in and found ways of dealing with that fear and that uncertainty. So you can see in this example is that we found a state of conservation through design fiction. And then we creatively released it so that we could keep moving forward. That's why I think design fiction is so powerful, is it gives us a different way of looking at the problems and opportunities of individuals who are in control or in influencing this design or this strategy. Any questions to that? I'm just kind of poking through some of these ideas. Yeah, so I'm going to talk to Javiera. Hopefully, I'm saying your name right. He had a question, or they had a question about taking care of basic needs, and most countries in the world have that question as a priority. What are the biggest challenges you see for applying biomimicry in countries with that mentality, or we'll say marginalized communities? Have you come across situations like that? To answer that question, yes. We during my master's and when I was working with Janine and Dana most closely, I was creating a program called Humanitarian Engineering, which looked at the social and environmental impacts of applied technology and how to work with marginalized communities. And I found that it's actually easier to apply biomimicry at those stages, in the sense that a lot of the communities I worked with had a different connection to nature and a different connection to ingenuity. You know, working in the slums, some of the slums in India, the way that they were creatively coming up with water solutions were so imaginative. And I guess it's a part of living on the edge, like when basic needs are so close to your everyday, you're forced to be creative. You're forced to be innovative, which is a sad reality, but I think it's also a part of why biomimicry is more easily adopted in marginalized communities, is because they're open to innovation, because they need to be. Oh, great. Thanks, Javier. Any other questions on design fiction, or anyone want to talk about that with regard to their company or where they're at? Feel free to raise a hand and we can bring you on. Okay. So Christina asks, can we share any resources for how to apply design fiction? I don't think quite honestly, this is something that we focus on in our course, Inspired by Nature, which I'm not sure if you're aware of, but it's a course that dives into all of these topics: the adaptive cycle, design fiction, application of biomimicry, and building a biomimicry business. And we're launching our next cohort in September, the 22nd. And the cohort is an international group of people that come together and walk through and work through this material together. So you can bring your own idea, or you can just use one of the ideas that we have to practically apply biomimicry. That's where a lot of our resources are. I'm not sure we have much else that's freely available at this point, but yeah, you can check it out at biomimicrycommons.com. Otherwise, I'll think about that, and I think maybe we could explore putting together a free PDF, a free resource to send out to people as well, especially people on our list. So if you're on our mailing list, that's where we'll probably send it to the people that are following us. So there are a couple other things I was going to talk about, but one of the things in doing design fiction is injecting nature-based principles. And so this goes back to that paradigm shift that I talked about, that in order to really create innovation, you have to design from a new paradigm, from a new lens. To build naturally, you have to think naturally. And nature's principles are a set of principles that we could use that come from nature that could teach us how to design and create more sustainably. There's a bunch of them, but you can also check out Biomimicry 3.8 has a great resource called Life's Principles. And it's essentially a checklist that that explores these principles in more depth. But I bring them up just as a point of conversation to say, when doing design fiction, to ensure that there's sustainability, instead of leveraging human ideas, leverage nature's ideas. And I know humans are nature, humans are natural, but we have a different way of thinking. So leverage these natural principles to ensure that the state of conservation you're creating is going to be sustainable. Suhaila, do you want to jump in there? Suhaila, you might, oh, there you go. Oh, I still can't hear you if you are chatting. Okay, Suhaila, if you if you do end up figuring out the audio or want to speak to that, let us know.
Can you hear me?
Oh, there you go.
Oh, there you go.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I was just madly clicking. Okay. Can I just speak? Thanks, Jamie. I'm really enjoying this. And can I just speak to the design fiction piece? Just
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, for sure.
So just when you were discussing it and the question that was raised, like the way it occurs for me is that it's actually just another way to see nature. Like it's not really a manual of A, B, or C for me. This is what you need to do. I think it's just more of a practice it's a perception for me. Like you can see a plant as like green on top, roots below, or you can see a plant as like a fully functioning system that incorporates the outside elements for its internal flexion and give us back to it. So it's just another way to see things. And maybe just something that came into mind, maybe what would be fun for you on your website that people could interact with is maybe if you just picked some subject, like pick one example, I don't know, a cloud, and you can just post that for the week, and then people could just have chats back and forth on making the design fiction for that piece, and not necessarily to any end, like each person might have their own goal in mind, but just the practice of seeing how that system could work in a design fiction sort of sense.
I think that's a great idea.
Because I think that question's come up a couple times in the recent things that I've been involved with biomimicry, and I just think it's more like people being in the practice of it, because I know when I'm not in the practice of it.
Oh, you muted there.
Oh, sorry. When I'm not in the practice of it, I can see a plant like green on top, roots below, period. And I'm a landscape architect, so it's not very powerful. But yeah, anyway, just a thought.
That's awesome. Thank you. And so, Christina, maybe that's a great way is we can share some design fictions on our Instagram or on our website, or encourage people to kind of interact with design fiction. But I think Suhaila is touching on a really important point, is design fiction is just a creative way of reimagining something. And so it's that opportunity to step out of the rooted paradigm that you have, to look at whether it's a leaf, whether it's a building, whether it's a sewer system, whether it's a company, just disrupt it creatively. It's almost like going back to your young self, your 5-year-old self, and redrawing what an airplane looks like to you, or what it could look like. So that's awesome, Suhaila. Thank you. And I think that's a great idea that we can encourage being in the practice of it more. So sharing more of our practice and encouraging people to engage with it more often. So thank you for that. Any other questions or things people want to bring up at this point? Okay.
Hello. Yeah,
Hey, Burhan, yes.
yeah. Coming back from coming on to the design fiction, I do agree that we have to think back to our 5-year-old selves, right? But what I struggle with is how do you tell where to stop, like to think about it realistically? Because like, of course, I'd like to be able to fly with like perhaps like some man-made wings or whatnot, but I'd have to think that, I wouldn't want to die in trying as well. Yeah. So how do you tell what is realistic and what is not?
Yeah,
Thanks.
great question. I think that brings us to the second part of, let me see, to this slide. So one of the things that we'll do is we'll come up with a set of believable ideas. And how we determine whether they're believable or not is that we actually accompany this design fiction with a catalog of technologies that we'll research to showcase how these ideas are believable. So whether they're like in a lab, they're being researched right now, or whether they're marketed on the market technologies, the catalog will actually help communicate our design fiction. And so what we're doing is we're starting to now connect this new basin of attraction with some small scale interventions for how this idea could be implemented today. So the catalog, we've done some catalogs in wastewater treatment systems. And in most urban environments, wastewater is treated it's pretty much all the same way. A centralized system into whatever, primary, tertiary treatment system that goes into a river or to a water source or whatever. But what are different ways you could think about that? And then we start to create a design fiction and come up with catalog of technologies to show that there are other ways of treating wastewater, and we could implement them in an urban environment in a creative way. Hopefully that that explains it a bit. Okay, thank you. I want to read Kathy's comment because I think it's a good one. Many designers and futurists practice scenario planning, which exposes multiple outcomes, worst to best case in ideas that help expose through our imagination the impact of small scale changes within the system. It would be wonderful to have biomimicry inspired thinking more fully integrated into processes. Yeah, I think, I appreciate that comment, Kathy. And I think what we're trying to communicate in this lecture or in this conversation is that if we keep pulling ideas from the past, like unless we actually creatively step out of our paradigm, our adaptive cycle is never going to really change. And biomimicry is a tool to encourage really different thinking for the most part. So that could be, if you want to make a business on being a futurist or a strategic foresight innovation specialist, if you brought biomimicry into your practice, I think that would make you quite niche and quite valuable, because what you can promote to people is that you're doing, you can guarantee more sustainable outcomes than any other person who's not using biomimicry, because they're going to be pulling on old ideas and old paradigms that are rooted in human exceptionalism. And as we can see, human exceptionalism has limitations. We will continue to fail and try to avoid failure if we rely only on human exceptionalism. But biomimicry invites us to draw on something bigger than ourselves, something with a longer time frame of research than ourselves, than our own species. And that makes it really unique. So I totally agree, Kathy, that we need to integrate biomimicry into that future planning, because I mean, right now our future planning, the most popular future planning is us going to Mars, which I think is pretty outrageous. How can we be more creative than that? How can we, in a lecture actually on a Clubhouse that we did on the weekend, one thing I mentioned is one of my future scenarios is having 20 billion people, humans on this planet. And I say that because I know it's confrontational. People will probably have a reaction to that. But the only way that 20 billion humans can survive on this planet is if we fundamentally shift the way that we think, behave, and create. Yeah, so I think that's an interesting future scenario for me, is how do we get to 20 billion people in a sustainable, harmonic way where there's more life than the current 7 billion population that we have today has destroyed. Yeah, thanks, Kathy. It's interesting to think about because there are species that, you know, they're probably large species. I think of trees. I don't know how many trees are on the planet, but they are massively consuming species. And so I like to think of us in a similar way, but trees do things so differently than us. You know, it uses only the energy of the sun. It creates conditions conducive to more life. It uses benign manufacturing. Everything's recyclable. It uses only a subset of periodic table of elements. It releases and reorganizes. It goes through that adaptive cycle. So if we could behave more like trees, then I think we could get to, you know, 20 billion humans, even 10. As Ian puts it, if we're not as energy efficient as trees, do we need to get to 20 billion? That's a good question. Okay, so Javiera says there's currently 3.04 trillion trees according to Google. Injecting says 20 billion people on Earth, an infinite source of energy, evenly spread, use of land and space, optimum use of air, utilization of different sources of water. The 5 key elements harnessed more judiciously. So anyways, I bring that up as a prompt, and feel free to use that if you're doing design fiction, because I think that's the only way those disruptive questions have to be asked in order for people to look at this differently, because we're on the trajectory to 20 billion. And I think everyone on the planet knows that it's unsustainable. Like, that will not happen on the current trajectory that we're on. So how do we get there is through life's principles, through nature-based practice. So I'm going to keep pushing here. Oh, I didn't finish my thought here. The design fiction gives us kind of a future scenario of where we can go. And then this exploit phase gives us opportunities to get there. So one technique that we use is this catalog of existing technologies. Another thing that we encourage is people to think like a weed, which goes back to where we just were. Thinking like a weed means be disconnected from how things currently are. Don't be convinced or swayed by how you think things currently are or should be. Weeds don't look at our environment that way. That's why weeds will see a crack in a pavement as an opportunity. They don't care. Like, a weed's not thinking, oh, I have to be in a forest to survive. That's where I need to grow my roots. That's where I'll be successful. A weed's like, hey, I got this tiny crack with tons of sunlight. I'm going to just exploit that opportunity. So thinking like a weed is a creative strategy for coming up with new ideas and seeing things, seeing opportunities that might not be seen by other people. This is something we focus on too in the course and at OCAD, is look around your world like you're a weed. A practical example I'll give you is one of my students at OCAD, this was in Toronto in Canada, would just walk down the street after class and looked at the buildings around him and saw all of these glass facades, these towers. And he thought, what a wasted opportunity, because it was raining as well. He's like, what if the sides of buildings could collect water as well instead of just rooftop rain harvesting? What about the sides of buildings? And so he started to come up with a biomimetic solution. It's a modular rain harvesting system that could be placed strategically to maximize rain collection on the sides of buildings. That's an example of thinking like a weed. A pigeon will see a pipe as a perfect opportunity to build a nest. I've seen cedar trees grow in the cracks of limestone. You know, you've all seen flowers and weeds grow in cracks of pavement. That's what thinking like a weed is all about. It's a mentality to encourage creative disruption, creative exploitation in that adaptive cycle. And so in your business, or what you're doing, you can look at both your business. If you run a business with a lot of employees, look at it like as a weed. Where are there resources and opportunities that aren't being utilized or that could be creatively reconnected or reorganized? And if you're an entrepreneur or you run your own business, where are there resources and assets in the world that are potentially exploitable? And I use exploitable not in the economic sense, well, partially in that sense, but more in like, you could use that as a free resource or as an abundant resource to pull from, to create, you know, a strategy or an idea or a solution. I think just going back to Uber and Airbnb, those are great examples of weed-like thinking. They saw underused cars and underused houses or dwellings as a wasted resource. And I can guarantee that because of the amount of consumption that our species does, there's going to be tons of underused or undervalued resources out there that you could exploit, that you could think like a weed to come up with clever ways of utilizing or strategizing. Any questions on that? I want to speak to Stephen's point in a second, but I'll ask if there are any questions to thinking like a weed. Or if anyone wants to raise their hand and share their thoughts. Injecting says, how do we not go overboard with exploiting opportunities? Good question. I think it goes back to that adaptive cycle model and our design fiction. So the exploit phase is all about trying to head in the direction of our design fiction. So exploit opportunities around us that could potentially lead to the vision that we have. So if the vision that you have is one where there's one company that has exploited every opportunity, well, then go for it. But that's not one that's going to be based in biomimetic principles. If your design fiction is one where you're like a forest ecosystem and the canopy is all intact and there isn't one tree that's 800 feet above the rest, well, then how do you exploit to a certain degree? Like you can embed those principles or those limitations in the early phases because it's all driven by the principles of that design fiction. How do you find balance? Yeah. I think balance also comes from nature-based principles of like if you increase the amount of diversity, if you focus on diversity rather than homogeneity, then you're heading towards a self-balancing ecosystem. If everyone has semi-autonomy and is working towards similar principles, then you have balance. That's, again, what forest ecology can teach us, that a forest naturally strives for equilibrium, even though it's always pushed away from equilibrium. But it's in that striving that there's constant innovation and evolution taking place. Steve brought a good point up. Steve Hill said, using biomimicry approach, there needs to be more consideration of mutualism in business and our relationship with the environment, opposed to competition and parasitism. I love that conversation, and I think it's a great point, Steve. One of the things that I think a lot of us were brought up with was this old idea of survival of the fittest, that nature is about competition. And I think that's coming from the way that old ideas have been misinterpreted. What we're learning today, especially through Susan Simard's book and research, Susan Simard wrote recently something called The Mother Tree, and her research at UBC has been influential on understanding how cooperative forests actually are. Same with Peter Wollenben, who wrote The Hidden Life of Trees or The Heartbeat of Trees. They're actually helping disrupt our earlier notions of ecosystems. And they're showing us that they're much more collaborative than we ever imagined. So if you're not aware of this mycelium research, what Susan has found is that trees are deeply connected through mycelium networks. And when I say Susan found it, I mean, I think she just published it. I know a lot of people prior to her knew about these things, but just didn't publish it. But trees are deeply connected through fungal networks, and through that fungal network will share information and resources. One study that Janine Benyus told me was that they introduced a pest on one side of a forest, and 3 days later, they found that the trees 1 kilometer away were making adaptations. And what that showcased was that these trees that were infested were communicating with the trees underground to say, there's an invasion of a foreign object and you need to make changes. Here's the information to change towards. And mother trees is an example that trees will share resources. The most successful trees will actually distribute resources to help the whole forest grow. So this idea of mutualism is super powerful because it's based on new ecological thinking. And I say new in quotations, new to me. And I think new to a lot of the Western world. But it's showing that nature works together. And it confronts this old idea that nature is just about competition. But I do want to say this, Steve, I still love the idea of competition in nature. And so what we call it in biomimicry frontiers and the biomimicry commons is actually coopetition. Because what competition evokes is innovation. It inspires change and adaptation. So if there's another biomimicry frontiers company or a company that does exactly something like us, that's going to inspire us to be even better at what we do and find our niche even more engagingly. We talk a lot about the importance of diversity. And so in our course, we also help people identify whatever they're a natural at, because we want everyone on this planet to be working and focused on what they're a natural at. And we want to encourage them to do that. And so we'll share resources and information to encourage businesses that are aligned with people's values and visions. And at the same time, so we'll cooperate, but we also want to inspire competition because we want those people to be the best at what they're doing. You know, we want them to find their niche, to be uncomfortable, to deal with that change and reorganization. So co-opetition is all about encouraging competition in a collaborative, cooperative environment, just like a forest. You think a beetle is going to be the best beetle it can be, and it's not trying to be a mosquito. And the frog is going to teach that mosquito to be the best mosquito it can be, or else it dies. So there needs to be competition. There needs to be some source of inspiration to get people to move, to get people to change, to get people to innovate. So we love this idea of coopetition, and we don't shy away from competition, but we live in the world of cooperation. Yeah, awesome, Steve. So he mentioned that we're exploring this with densely planting trees to help them grow faster into a forest, this Miyawaki method for tree planting. That's a method we've actually used in a design in India. So yeah, there's some cool like competition I don't think should be seen as a bad thing. But as long as people are aligned with, I think a key point to this is as long as people are building things that are aligned with their own skill sets, their own passions, their own values. If they're trying to be something else, there's going to be like a lack of integrity, an awkwardness to it, and it might come from a weird place. But when you're committed to what you're doing, those are the people I love to compete and cooperate with. People who are passionate about landscape architect, for example, and they want to be the best that they can be at that, because that's what, you know, their skill sets, or that's what they're a natural at. I think that's when a forest grows more effectively, is when everyone's aligned with those parts of themselves, you know, those things that they're a natural at, instead of trying to be something they're not, because that's not how a healthy ecosystem works. Like I said, a beetle doesn't try to be a mosquito. Awesome. So I think the last thing, actually, I'll open it up to questions at this point, because that was everything that we wanted to talk about. I know there's a lot there, but we are recording, and we will share it with this crew, the recording, if you want to go back to some of these. I know some of the slides, for example. If there are any questions or comments, feel free to raise your hand or type them in the comment box and we can address them. Okay. If not, if you are interested in learning more about this or engaging with us on a deeper level, I did mention that we're starting our next cohort of Inspired by Nature. It's an online course that walks through not only just what we talked about today, but also practical applications of biomimicry. We share our case studies at Biomimicry Frontiers. We share other people's case studies. We help you learn how to abstract nature's genius. And we focus on that paradigm and on building your own biomimicry brand or business, making it align with your values. So if there's interest from anyone on this, please check out biomimicrycommons.com, but we'll be opening up the cart for that course September 1st. It starts September 22nd. I would love to work through challenges with you if this is of interest to you. I know we've had some of our founding members in this conversation. I saw Jono, Suhaila. So it's awesome to really build this community of like-minded practitioners and share as much as we can to encourage that healthy ecosystem, like I said. Thank you so much for coming, everyone. Thanks for the engagement. It was awesome. Great questions. And if you have any other questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. But check out Inspired by Nature at biomimicrycommons.com if you're interested. All right. If there's nothing else, thanks, Jonna. All right. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great day. Thanks for joining us. It was such an awesome time to be with you.
Thank you, everyone.